Good morning. I'm Bill Hamblet, the Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Welcome to this morning's panel discussion, which is focused around the question, are we able to procure, upgrade, and adapt to meet the demands of great power competition? Special thanks to Lockheed Martin as our sponsor for this panel. We couldn't put on this event, we couldn't put on our panel discussions without the support of our sponsors. So special thanks to Lockheed Martin, represented here this morning by Dion Vergoots. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Mr. Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Bryan is an expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, military competition, and wargaming. From 2013 to 2019, Bryan served as a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where he led studies for the DoD Office of Net Assessment, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and DARPA on new technologies and the future of warfare. Mr. Clark also served as a special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Greenert, and director of his Commander's Action Group, where he led development of Navy strategy and implemented new initiatives in electromagnetic spectrum operations, undersea warfare, expeditionary operations, and personnel and readiness management. In addition, Bryan is a retired Navy submarine officer, and he's an expert moderator who moderated a panel for us at Defense Forum Washington just a couple of months ago. So Bryan, the panel is yours.
Oh, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. That was very nice, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm honored to be here with these august gentlemen who are obviously much more expert than I in the topic that we're going to discuss today. So I'll go ahead and introduce them, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. So first of all, to my left, my immediate left, Admiral Tom Moore is the current commander of Naval Sea Systems Command, a second-generation naval officer. He was commissioned in 1981 from the United States Naval Academy. A glutton for punishment, he was a surface Navy nuke, which is probably the hardest job I think of in the Navy, and was served on several ships, South Carolina, Virginia, and the Enterprise in the nuclear world, as well as Coinenham and other conventional ships as a surface warfare officer. He then was selected in 1994 to the Engineering Duty Officer community, and led projects for overhauls of aircraft carriers, including the Enterprise, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Nimitz, before taking over as in-service carriers program manager, where he was in charge of new construction and overhauls of Nimitz-class carriers such as the George H.W. Bush and the RCOH, the refueling overhaul of the Dwight D. Eisenhower. Admiral Moore commanded the PEO Program Executive Office for Aircraft Carriers until 2016, when he took over his current job as the 44th Commander of Naval Sea Systems Command, overseeing a staff of 73,000 people that support our Navy's submarines, surface ships, and associated systems. To Admiral Moore's left is Admiral Dean Peters, who is the Commander of Naval Air Systems Command. He's a 1985 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, as well as being a graduate of the Navy's Test Pilot School. Previous to his time now as the Commander of Naval Air Systems Command, he earned his wings as Naval Aviator in 1986, commanded the Navy's Air Test and Evaluation Squadron, HX-21, and was program manager for H-60 helicopters once he became a member of the acquisition community. Until 2014, Admiral Peters commanded the Presidential Helicopters Office, and then took over Commander Naval Air Warfare Center Atlantic Aircraft Division, and was the Assistant Nav Air Commander for Research and Engineering. He assumed his current role as Naval Air Systems Commander in 2018. To Admiral Peters' left is General Arthur Pasagian of the Marines. He is the commander of the Marine Systems Command. He enlisted in the Marine Corps back in 1987 and was commissioned in 1990 after going through an officer candidate program. His assignments as a logistician in the Marines included command at every level, from platoon up to the battalion command level. He deployed with the 11th BU to Somalia as part of Operation Continuing Hope, and deployed for Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. Once he entered the acquisition community, he was program manager for the infantry combat equipment until 2010, was in charge of operational test evaluation activity for the Marine Corps until 2014, and was military assistant for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for acquisition in the Office of the Secretary of Defense until 2016, when he took over as the Chief of Staff for Marine Corps Systems Command, and then took over in 2018 as the Commander of Marine Corps Systems Command. To General Pasagian's left is, I got out of order here. Admiral Nathan Moore from the Coast Guard. He is currently the Deputy Commander for Coast Guard Area Pacific, following assignments as the Chief of Staff there. He was commander of the Coast Guard cutter Stratton, and previous to that was served on Polar Star, Harriet Lane, the Coast Guard cutter Venturous, and Coast Guard cutter Resolute. He is, he served from 2013 to 2015 as Chief of Office of Naval Engineering at the Coast Guard headquarters, and has been a registered professional engineer in the state of Michigan since 1999. And then to Admiral Moore's left is Admiral Christian Boris Becker, native of New York City, who graduated in 1987 from Boston University and was commissioned in the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps program after that. He's served as a EA-6B Prowler Electronic Warfare or Electronic Countermeasures Officer, ECMO, and is a plank owner of the Joint Crew Composite Squadron 1, JIX-1, a special mission unit designed to apply electronic warfare in the fight against improvised explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan. A member of the Aerospace Engineering Duty Officer Community and Space Cadre, Admiral Becker has held positions in Naval Sea Systems Command and Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command. He's also served as a Systems Engineer and Deputy Division Chief at the National Reconnaissance Office. And he has served at Naval Air Station Patuxent River as the Chief Engineer. As Program Manager for the National Security Space Program, Admiral Becker led interagency and joint forces providing national joint and naval forces intelligence information, and as well as being commander of SPA-WAR's space field activity, leading the civilians and sailors supporting the NRO. He's been the PEO C4I and the PEO Space Systems from 2013-2017, and took over NAVWAR, his current position, in 2017, where he leads a workforce of 10,500 civilian and military personnel. So we're very honored to have these gentlemen on our panel today to talk about the how we develop and field capabilities faster, and do it in a way that's able to deal with our great power competitors such as Russia and China. So the floor here really kind of highlights the challenge that the Navy and Marine Corps and Coast Guard are facing today, which is the introduction of new technologies like we see with AWS and Nokia and other companies like Juniper Systems, Oracle, that are here to help the government try to field new data management and communications technologies, while at the same time sustaining our existing capabilities, which are centered around legacy systems, platforms like ships and aircraft and submarines. The introduction of those new technologies has been a very challenging proposition for each of these gentlemen to deal with. It's something the U.S. government has wrestled with in the acquisition community. And so the first question I guess I would have for our panelists is, how do we intend to incorporate new technologies into our current and planned force more quickly? So what are some of the avenues to do that? We've got the new mid-tier acquisition approach that's been approved by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We've got prototyping that's being done at various levels of the government, both competitive prototyping and single provider prototyping. We've got our traditional acquisition system that slowly introduces technologies into new capabilities. And then we've got new approaches that might look at trying to bring together capabilities in multiple domains through wargaming and experimentation, and try to put things together in the field that wouldn't have been developed otherwise by the acquisition program. So there's a number of new approaches out there to try to bring these new technologies into the naval force. And a question for each of you is, how do you envision the future of this going? How are we going to be able to incorporate new technologies, and how can industry access the government to be able to offer what they're developing in their own labs and their own experimentation? So Admiral Moore, we'll start.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian, for that introduction and for the question. So I think it's important that you look at the panel, which is, are we able to procure, upgrade, and adapt to meet great power competition? I think you mentioned it there, but I think you have to add in there, are we able to procure, upgrade, and sustain and maintain what we have? So there's it's not an either or. We tend to focus most of our effort on the buying of new stuff and getting new technology out to the ships faster, but there's a key element on the sustainment side that we have to focus on. So I think the answer is I would say is an absolute yes if. I tend to focus on getting after things in that realm. And so the answer is yeah, we absolutely can do this, but we're going to have to think about the problems, I think, differently than we're doing today, challenge a bunch of the assumptions that are out there, and in many ways stop doing things that are adding no value to the things that we're adding to the fleet today, and there's a number of those things. You mentioned up front some of the new acquisition authorities, some of those things. Those will absolutely help, but having been an acquisition professional now for 25 plus years, my experience has been that, tweaking DoD 5000 always sounds good on paper, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really get you the outcomes that you're looking at. So we ought to take advantage of those authorities to be more agile and to get things out to the fleet quicker. But I don't think you can rely solely on what's on a piece of paper in an acquisition regulation to do that. I other think there's also another part of this. We tend to focus on the speed to the fleet piece. That's obviously critically important, but it's I think the thing you have to also focus on is speed to the fleet of what. And so we can get things out to the fleet fast, but if you're not getting things out to the fleet fast what they're looking for, or things out to the fleet fast that are sustainable and are agile and can adapt to the future, then checking off that box of fast really doesn't do you any good. So I think we need to focus on more than just the speed portion of it. I think there's a critical piece about getting this right. We tend to focus most of our efforts on the shipbuilding side of the house, on speed to fleet on the shipbuilder, and most of our wrath is focused on them. I think that what I've seen over the past 25 years is that most of the shipbuilders out there, or all the shipbuilders, want to do the right job, the people that are inserting technology. The most important thing is on the Navy side for us is to build a plan and build a set of requirements and make sure industry understands what those are, and we have a common understanding of that. That's, I think, the absolute key at the end of the day. We tend to say we want a car that goes 0 to 60 in 2.7 seconds. I want it to be the best handling car. I want it to have a Bose stereo system. I want it to have leather. I want it all this other stuff. And I'll say to you, well, that sounds like a Porsche 911 GTS. And the Pentagon will say, that's exactly what I want. I want a Porsche 911 GTS. And we'll take them down to the Porsche dealer, and there it is. And they'll say, that's exactly what I want. That's perfect. Let's do that. And the Porsche dealer will say, well, that's $145,000. And the Pentagon will say, well, I only have $85,000, but that's the car I want, so why don't you go ahead and give it to me? And so I think we've got to be more realistic about, when we're talking about the speed, is getting those requirements set up front. I think, to your point, the key way to do that, and I'll finish up my remarks here and turn it over to my friend Dean Peters, is get industry involved in the process as early as possible about what the art of the possible is and have those trade-offs. I think a good example of that is going to be the FFGX program that's going to come out here pretty soon. That has moved pretty quickly from requirements definition to a point where we're going to ready to down select and issue a construction contract. And that's been as collaborative I've seen with industry on what the art of the possible is up front. So I think that's the model that you want to follow up front. So I look forward to the rest of the questions from the panel, and Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Just by way of introduction, Naval Air Systems Command supports all things naval aviation to include the Navy and the Marine Corps, and we also support the Coast Guard too. I was just discussing with Admiral Moore beforehand some of the projects that we're working on for the Coast Guard. Also by way of introduction, I think it's apparent to everyone, certainly who's ever been in the job, that our program managers are under incredible pressure. It's certainly one of, if not the most dynamic major command position that we put our Navy captains in and our Marine Corps colonels. And so all of these things that we're talking about is really, helping the program managers be successful. On the NavAir side, we're trying to improve every day. I want to echo what Admiral Moore said about sustainment. The first thing we have to do is fix readiness. doesn't do us a whole lot of good to field a lot of capability if it's never available. We've had some successes there. You all are very familiar with, say, the physiological episodes that we've had in Navy aircraft. Those are way, way down this year. We want to make sure that, I see Kramer there in the front row from BFA 2. We want to make sure that he's able to go out and do his mission and not have to worry about the oxygen system or the pressurization system. So we're fixing the readiness piece even as we are working on ways to accelerate delivery of capability. The capability delivery, you can think about it in two different aspects. The first is really what are we doing on the acquisition side to speed things up? And there's many things that I can talk about if you're interested in those. There's also the organic capability for developing new technologies that we have at our warfare centers and our labs. I think that's a key aspect of getting technology delivered and in the hands of the warfighter. At the same time, though, we have to realize that no single entity can do everything. There's no single entity in industry, there's no single entity in the government that can field a complete weapon system. It has to be a cooperation. So to Mr. Clark's question in regarding, how can industry access government, we do have cooperative research and development agreements that we have with industry for the use of our test ranges and our laboratories and things like that, where we can actually get out and demonstrate technology and maybe speed up the requirements review process and get interest that doesn't have to wait for the entire POM cycle. And that's where I'll leave you at this point, and happy to follow up on any of those topics as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. General.
Good morning. My name is A.J. Pasagian, and it's a pleasure to sit up here with this group and be provided the opportunity to share some of these thoughts from the Marine Corps' perspective. The Congress has given us a lot of authorities in the 2016 NDAA. I'm going to focus on that at a kind of inflection point for the United States Marine Corps, where the tilt is definitely on modernization. I think notably the leadership is focused on Section 804 and 806. 804 is a mid-tier approach that you heard mentioned up here, I think, twice already. And that really enables us to get after two very practical pathways to fielding a capability earlier. The other is 806. I think 806 is probably the most helpful piece of legislation we've had in a really long time. 806 enables us to bring in, through a variety of means, early industry participation and tap that piece of industry, that component of industry that's sort of non-traditional, innovative. I think the speed of research and development on the commercial sector relative to what we do in government is something like 3 to 1, just very general terms. We want to take advantage of that. So OTAs give us that type of access, and competitive prototyping under 806 enables us to take what we've learned there, what we've seen, put it in the hands, into the meat hooks of American Marines, and then get into production without having to go through another round of competition. That is really helpful when we're really getting after a very distinct modernization effort in the Marine Corps. At Systems Command, Marine Corps Systems Command, we've awarded 41 OTAs, roughly a 50-50 split in consortiums and our own. I think that what you've seen in the real world for our PM for wargaming, Force on Force Next, ground-based ship interdiction systems, those types of activities are being supported by what I mentioned, 804 and 806. The CPG is really our catalyst, and the Commandant's been very vocal and I think very practical in terms of where it is we need to go. So this is driving us. Getting there with the Navy is absolutely essential. And when we come together to do these kinds of things, it's actually a pretty fearsome team. So I'm really excited to be a part of it. I think the new law helps us and our PEOs and what it is that we're getting ready to do. I'm happy to be up here and to discuss some of that, and look forward to taking some of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, General. Admiral Moore?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. The other Admiral Moore up here, not to be confused. We've been on a few panels already this year, so I think we've got the drill down. But for the Coast Guard side, thanks for inviting us and including me here. I'm the sustainment guy for the Coast Guard. You know, we're small enough that we have one organization that runs sustainment of our cutters and aircraft and the shore facilities that we have, and that's me. And what I worry about today in terms of great power competition is how we make the Coast Guard successful in our current big surge of acquisition that we have going on. And for those of you in the audience that pay attention, the booths out here on the floor, we're in the middle of the biggest recapitalization of our surface and air fleet that we've ever undergone. So we have national security cutters, which are basically frigates painted white with an orange stripe on them that come out of Huntington Ingalls. We've got 8 of those on our way to 11 or more, potentially. We have an offshore patrol cutter that's going to be built down in Panama City. We've got a program of record of 25 of those coming. We have brand new fast response cutters. These are offshore patrol boats that have come out of Bollinger, and we've got about 35 of those on a way to a program of 58 of those. Aircraft-wise, we've got new C-130Js that come off the line for us every year. We've got the C-27Js that we're having missionized, and NavAir's helping us quite a bit with that. So in the midst of all that recapitalization, we also have the really, really old, built in the 1960s and 70s Coast Guard that you still see out there. We have about 200, and if you just look at ships, we have about 230 cutters that go offshore, not the station boats that do search and rescue, but the actual offshore law enforcement and defense cutters. We got about 230 something of those, and you know, more than half of them were built back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They have pneumatic controls from the engine room. They're pretty cyber hardened because there is nothing you can hack. So that makes our cyber people happy, but they're antiquated, and for me as the sustainment guy, I worry about how we are going to move forward with these new national security cutters, for example, that are worldwide deployers. We just sent 2 of them over to the 7th Fleet this past year to deploy in South China Sea and up and around Korea doing UN Security Council resolution enforcement. So you know, they're worldwide deployers. They refuel at sea. And then we balance that again with these old ships that were built so long ago. So on the sustainment side, as we deal with parts obsolescence and new modernized control systems and cyber security issues, that's kind of my primary concern when I think about how we prepare ourselves for great power competition. Thank you.
Thanks, Admiral. Admiral Becker?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here with you once again to talk about how we need to go faster in acquisition. I think we talked about that last year, and then we talked about that the year before, and the year before that, and we're going to talk about it next year. So how do we go faster? Well, first, I kind of want to get a sense of who's in the audience. So uniformed members of our allies and U.S., can you raise your hands? Okay. Industry? Academia? PLA? As we talk about great power competition and we talk about going faster, for us in the information business, there are a couple of ways we can get after that. Part of it is the acquisition authorities that my colleagues have already discussed, whether that's OTA or SBIRs. In fact, we have an OTA called the Information Warfare Research Project, which has over 400, actually now up to 500 participants. And we're moving fast. We're awarding contracts. The average contract value is about $1.3 million. What I'm looking for, though, is how those contracts then lead to production. And so I'm looking for the proof in that pudding. But we're going fast with that sort of stuff. That's part of it, the acquisition strategies, if you will, about how to go faster. But then there's the technical side. And in our world of information, part of that is modernizing the networks. How do we modernize the networks so that the software, which are the weapons, if you will, that we're going to put in the network, can move there faster? How do we develop the software more quickly? Well, one way is to use things like a software armory, where we allow folks to come into that armory, if you will, and use the tools and the procedures and the standards to rapidly develop capability, test it, and move it into production. Well, then you got to secure it. Right? So now we look at the securing process. What does that take? How long does it take to get an ATO? The answer, too long. So how do we accelerate that? Accelerate the software development, accelerate the ATO delivery. In order to do that, though, we need that fundamental network layer to be agile enough with the right rule sets so that all the players that are bringing weapons capabilities, i.e. software, whether it's command and control or ISR or METOC or fill in the blank, know how to develop to that app store, if you will, can develop that capability in conjunction with the user community so we know we're solving the right problem, and then get that out in the field with an ATO operating, ready for sailors to operate and maintain it. Acquisition authorities, technical architectures, and, oh, by the way, the data. How do we make sure we're using the data as the resource that it really is? And we talk about digitizing our Navy. I don't know if there's a verbification of the word data, but maybe there should be. Because data, well, somebody once said data is the new bacon. So I think we better get after our approach to how we use that valuable resource. Thanks.
Thanks, Admiral. So that brings up a point that I think be good to explore further is you've all talked about mechanisms that we're using to try to speed the introduction of new technologies into the fleet. I think one of the challenges that we're going to face going forward is to deal with a great power competitor. Any of our capabilities are going to require highly integrated systems between different domains, different platforms to be able to deliver a mission capability. So whereas before we might have had the luxury of developing a new weapon system in a stovepipe, we now don't have that luxury when you're dealing with competitors like China and Russia to a lesser degree. So for example, we talk about expeditionary advanced base operations, deploying Marines onshore, using counter-maritime capabilities to contribute to the naval fight. Now you're bringing together capabilities from pretty much every one of these organizations that you represent. How are we going to deliver mission capability through an acquisition and engineering development process that's kind of stovepipe by nature?
Yeah.
So, General, you can to you first.
I'll jump on that one first. So when General Berger spent his time at Combat Development and Integration, we spent a lot of time giving this thought because we saw what was coming. And we developed a plan that's threat-based and is projected out in a 10-year time horizon. So our target set right now is 2030. And in 2019, as a Marine, you're sitting there and you're like, okay, and you happen to understand this acquisition business, you look at FY20 as the entry point, the line of departure into the first FIDIP to make these changes. General Berger coined the term of the three amigos. So for force development, and it's no secret, I carry the CPG with me. I've read this thing about 18 times. Every time I read it, I learn something new. But the first priority for the Marine Corps is force design, and then into force development. And what the three amigos do is they execute force development for the service. So in Quantico, we happen to be blessed by the fact that I can literally run to any one of these commands, hardly breaking a sweat. We're really close proximity. We work well together. We go to the club. We smoke cigars and drink whiskey together. Mm-hmm. And what it is it starts with the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. That represents our Futures Directorate. They're doing the S&T and experimentation, the technical elements that Admiral Becker talked about that get into the entry point of development. It goes over to CD&I, our Capability Development Directorate. There's a second amigo. They write the CONAMPs. And at some point, I need a requirement. I need an ICD or CDD. For an MTA, the minimum is an ICD, and that's great because that allows us, on the material side, third, to move into a well-developed and articulated requirement, experiment, scientific-based, repeatable mechanism that's worthy of investment for the force. So having it confined and unity of effort is really important there, and I think we're blessed with that. So we're looking to take advantage of that. Three amigos, that's my answer. There you go.
I mean, and it seems Admiral Moore and Admiral Peters from the Navy, a Navy equivalent might be if you look at the concept for distributed maritime operations, we're going to try to deceive and confuse and distribute our forces so that the adversary has more targets to deal with. Creating a mission capability to deceive an enemy regarding our force disposition and actions is going to require capabilities to be developed on ships, in the air, on mission systems, and then networks that go between them. So you've got multiple organizations that now need to work together to deliver something that's coherent at the end. And how do you do that? Or how do you plan on doing that?
Well, it takes a lot more collaboration than we probably had in the past, and you're right about the stovepipe. I think, the gate review process that RDA has now that's chaired with the Vice Chief is an opportunity at every step along the way in an acquisition process to bring in all the stakeholders and recognize that you're not just buying a ship or just buying a network, that there's an integrated piece to this. And so we've got to do a lot better, and that, I think, within OpNav, that gate review process is the way at which we're kind of going to vet some of these things out. There's a blue and green aspect to it that we've got to remember. And the other piece is, we tend to focus only on the platforms that are going to sea. We're finding more and more that as we build these platforms and we integrate things, that we neglect the shore piece of that goes along with it, which is how do you sustain it later?
Right.
From the shipyard standpoint, hey, do we have the right dry docks? Do we have the right equipment to go do that? And so I think it's actually even gotten more complicated, and will continue to be more complicated going forward, and we've got to be a lot more collaborative than we've been in the past. But I do think the process that we're using today through the gate reviews is the way forward for us. Turn it over to you.
Yeah, the term that you don't hear as much today as perhaps a few years ago is I&I, the integration and interoperability. I think the reason why you don't hear it that much is because it's no longer new. We're actually doing it. We've stood up within NavAir a program office that's responsible for I&I, PMA 298. It's not tied to any particular platform. They're the ones that are leading the analysis of alternatives for the next generation air dominance. They're the ones that are producing the systems engineering products that are needed for NIFCA, Naval Integrated Fires. The key here is the speed. So it's understanding the threat assessment, producing those systems engineering products that can be used for the software updates for E2D, for Super Hornet, for Aegis, for our weapon systems. And that's happening. That's at the aviation side, and then at the Pentagon side, we just sent one of our program managers who finished up a tour with our mission planning program office. He's going up to a digital integration office at the Pentagon to help start tying this type of integration between the different systems commands. So we'll monitor that closely, but I think that speaks to the integration that you were talking about, Bryan.
It seems like a lot of this integration, though, has to do with the networks and, like Admiral Becker was saying, the data, both internal to the platform, through the data bus, but also by using radio communication links or other communication methods. So Admiral Becker, to what degree are your guys getting brought into these discussions about how to deliver a new mission capability, or does it end up being that the network's an afterthought once you've kind of decided what platforms and mission systems to use?
Well, that's kind of a red meat question.
Sorry.
The way we used to do it wasn't effective, and so we had to change it, and we're still changing that. As I think my colleagues have already talked about, there are a couple different ways. One is the gate review process. That's a check at the Pentagon level. But as Admiral Peters discussed, there's real value in the far left and systems engineering to understand what those mission needs are, and understand them in a way that we can model, and then model those needs against how we're going to deliver the capability. And so we've undertaken, in particular in the realm of C4I and space systems, a rigorous process to look at what the mission threads are that are most critical to meet. And then we can tie that to other models in a federated model scheme. So when you start to talk about model-based systems engineering, you can really start to pull the mission thread through from one platform to another system through the network, through the lightning bolts, and understand what really needs to occur. And if you really go varsity with that, because you have the data, now you can start to create a digital representation of the capabilities that you've delivered. Well, that's pretty cool, because now what happens, especially in the network side of things, if something goes wrong in the real world, I know what right looks like. I got a way to not only operate, but sustain that capability and look to see what changes have occurred and what I need to change back in order to fix it. All that comes back to the data. And the upfront heavy lifting systems engineering that starts when you start to talk about what the mission need is. Now, we can work across the SysComs. We have that structure. We have the technical architecture board. We have the teamwork across the SysComs where we can make that happen.
And so what degree has that led to investment in command and control tools versus just, building networks? I mean, you think of C3 as a portfolio, you've got comm systems, you've got C2 tools. Has the investment in C2 tools increased because of the need to better manage the integration of a widening collection of capabilities?
First, we have to get after the infrastructure that's underneath it to make sure that that infrastructure is there. Those of you who heard the Department of the Navy's CIO speak at lunch yesterday, he talked about individuals accruing email addresses like you might accrue old cell phones. And that's because, well, if you look at Air Wing 5 in Japan, they might have an email address for when they're ashore in Japan. They have an email address for when they go out to the boat. They got an email address when they come back to Fallon or go to Guam. We got to fix that. And then we can start talking about how do we improve the command and control, even on our ships today. And we're working on that.
Admiral Moore, Nate Moore, so the Coast Guard's been deploying a lot more frequently with naval forces or in operations that are increasingly what a Navy force might have done, particularly look at the South China Sea and what you've been doing in the Pacific. To what degree are you trying to tie the lessons learned from those deployments into capability development? And is the Navy and the Marine Corps, have they been able to work with the Coast Guard to field the capabilities you need for maybe the next generation of those deployments?
Yeah, what we did for the 7th Fleet most recently this past year with those two different deployments is, the beauty of this under the National Fleet Board concept, right, is that those ships are built and sustained, through a jointly managed program with the Navy and NAVSEA in particular. And so those ships have Navy-type, Navy-owned equipment on them. They have all the same standards for mil-spec design and everything that a Navy ship does. So the beauty of those deployments this summer is we were able to, we literally chopped, TACON and OPCON to 7th Fleet. I mean, during the period of time those ships were deployed, they did not work for us in the Coast Guard, right? And that, we still paid their salaries, but that was about it. And the beauty of that is then the operational commander, the fleet commander, can then use those ships as he or she deems most useful. So what we're good at, which is low-end conflict, law enforcement, things you wouldn't want to set a BMD DDG out to do, right? Because it would be a waste of that asset. Well, you can send a Coast Guard cutter out there to protect the sea lanes communication, that kind of thing, right? So I think logistically we followed the same model. So when we chopped those ships to 7th Fleet, we chopped them to the 7th Fleet 4, the 4 shop for support. So CASREP parts, all of the connectivity, through the satellite, all that was done the same way that 7th Fleet manages it for the rest of their ships. So the answer to the question of sort of how do we prepare for great power competition is to continue that model and use that more robustly. If we have a true national fleet that in times of conflict can be melded together, like I'm describing, then the support, the logistics for that needs to be able to meld together that way too, right? Because, the typical Coast Guard way that we do at CONUS is I ship parts FedEx, to the search and rescue station in Florida or whatever, right? Well, that doesn't work, in Oceania, that doesn't work in the South China Sea or in the Northern Arctic, in North Sea, that kind of thing. So I think these overseas deployments have helped really push us in the direction of providing that sustainability jointly with the Navy.
Have the deployments revealed some new capabilities that your cutters need to be able to effectively, not obviously going into armed confrontations with the Chinese, but if you want to counter ISR systems that they have, or you want to, try to do some of the things that distributed maritime operations might aspire to do. Has some of that, some of those lessons been able to get, translated into?
They have. I mean, we have, the idea again, for the 7th Fleet Commander, when those ships, were in CHOPTM, the idea was they would be fully operational. And there would not be places they couldn't go, right? Or places where he couldn't use them because they might, be a missile sponge. So he was really key on having them fully operational in the sense of, countermeasures and all of the different suite of Navy-owned equipment that we have on board those ships. But it revealed the fact that for us that to step up into that game at that level is a huge resource demand on us that we're not used to. And so some of you may know this, but underneath DHS, right, we have 11 statutory missions, and one of those is national defense.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a challenge.
Keep you busy. So I got one more question, then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So if audience members have questions, you can start posting up by these microphones that are strategically placed throughout the audience. So the question I have is, a lot of what we talked about today is changes in acquisition authorities, changes in the relationship between government and industry in developing new capabilities, identifying ways to integrate between organizations to better serve missions. All of those start to make you wonder whether the traditional requirements process is, if not dead, it's changing. How do we build requirements for new capabilities when we've got a lot more mechanisms to define what we need in a new system based on the art of the possible, based on what's happening within other services, based on what's happening with the threat, and lessons learned from that set of operations. So are we envisioning a situation where we're going to have to change how we define requirements that'll be much more responsive to the art of the possible and what the threat is presenting, or are we going to continue down the road of trying to define requirements in isolation? And if so, what does that imply for the sustainability of future systems? Because that's a lot of what our requirements process is designed to do, is to foresee the ability of a new system to be sustained in the future. So I don't know who wants to take that first.
Well, I don't think, I think the requirements development process can't be done in a vacuum, and it's a lot more complex domain today to build a requirement set than it may have been 15, 20, 25 years ago. So I don't think the requirements definition process is broken or needs to be changed. I just think you have to recognize it's a lot more complex warfighting world than it was 25, 30 years ago. But the basic requirements definition and understanding what it is you want and what it is you want that platform to do, I think remains unchanged. That's core to what we're going to do. How you go about building those requirements is, I think, I would argue, be a lot more complex today than it was 25, 30 years ago. But the basic mechanics of sitting down and understanding what it is you want, what type of capability, based on the requirement, what can industry build for you? Does that meet your need? What will that cost? How long will it take to get there? What are the trade-offs? I don't think that fundamentally changes.
And I'll just briefly, from the traditional acquisition process, where I see changes coming into effect is the use of more prototyping. And there's lots of different ways to do that. We mentioned, being able to prototype industry ideas at our warfare centers, at our labs, the test capability that we have. Mostly it's about communication, being able to communicate the requirements more effectively, especially as they get more complicated, as Admiral Moore said. That's an area that we're still working on. But to the extent that we can prove out technology, our normal acquisition process where we release an RFP, we get the proposals back, and then we go through this evaluation process where we're really trying to see, on paper, who understands the requirement the best, but we really have no sense of what that capability will bring, what the reliability of that capability is. And so to the extent that we can get in early with some of this prototyping. Some of our most successful programs from an acceleration standpoint have been in just those situations where we've been able to prove out the technology before we had to go through the acquisition process. Thank you.
In the software area, there are ways that we can not throw away the requirements process because it's there for a reason, but maybe evolve it based on the kinds of capabilities and the timelines that we're talking about. So we're not going to throw out the ideas of objective and threshold requirements and what you have to meet, but maybe in some places a minimum viable product is actually the threshold that you'll accept. Now, that takes communications and transparency between the fleet operators, the technical community, and the sponsors willing to accept that it's not, it may be a minimum viable product and not everything you wanted. Now, who else is involved in that, though? You got to look at the test community and how do we test? How do we test for something to see that it's operationally effective if we're talking about an MVP versus a threshold or objective? And then there's our oversight. If Congress appropriated dollars for a particular capability, how do we have the trust and transparency that when we say we can deliver this now, that's acceptable to deliver as we continue to work on improving it, but we don't wait for perfect and leave the operator, leave the fleet without that capability that we could put out there.
I'll add 3 points to it. From my perspective, I think the Navy and Marine Corps have never been in a better spot on requirements development. This particular PB21 rollout has been very closely linked between N9 and CD&I. An example is the way that we're going about integrated naval force structure assessment. And we absolutely have to be that way because that's the way that we fight. So it has to be that way in force development. And on the experimentation side, to get after what Admiral Peters had mentioned on prototyping, doing it in a competitive way, tapping that element of industry that's non-traditional. We do in the Navy Marine Corps team as well. So that's Antex and co-hosted and co-participatory, kind of thing, in an environment that's likely to yield a requirement or a formative requirement. I think third is just in a very simple sense is people. And diversity matters, right? So I came into acquisition off the Navy staff, writing requirements for black bottom and gray-hulled ships, working very closely with NAVC on that. I just don't see someone being helpful in the acquisition community as a program manager or otherwise, a tester, if they're not conversant in that type of vernacular. You need to get into that world, and we need, this is the personnel and the workforce excellence issue where you really rely on people who are diverse and can switch off channel from either T&E to requirements and into program management or financial management. So that's really important, and I think that really counts because it's a people business, and that's the bottom line.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. So let's turn it over to the audience. Sir, do you have a question, Admiral Daly?
I do. I'll just interject here. We've got the strongest possible signal from the Commandant of the Marine Corps and from the CNO that they want to get at integrated naval warfare, and it's very believable, and I think they're pretty serious. So I was just going to ask the systems commanders, because you're responsible for so many platforms and programs, is there an early opportunity, whether it's a platform, a program, or just an area, just maybe cite one each, that you think is ripe for this, that could lead to something good in the integration front, either from a capability standpoint or a savings standpoint? Thank you.
I'll start by just saying UAS and counter UAS. I think there's tremendous integration there for the naval forces, and we have some success with that already and need to build on it.
Yeah, I was going to go in the unmanned. Clearly is an area where there's integrated on the combat systems side of the house. As we evolve into AMDR, there's there's great opportunity there for integrated across and how you use that from a warfighting standpoint across the syscoms and across the warfighting domains.
I'd offer up long-range precision fires, what we do on ship, how we translate and push select tracks on the Navy's backbone into marine command and control systems that are designed implicitly to provide surface fires from a marine detachment in an EABO ashore. That's very real, and that takes us back to our roots. That's part of our culture.
And clearly, how we blend our networks, so that rather than Marines bringing all of the gear and their own vertical stack, if you will, onto a ship and then having to take it off back again where they go somewhere, how do we just extend one network across the entire integrated maritime fight?
And for Rear Admiral Moore, I just want to ask from a coast, not to leave out the Coast Guard, what's something that you would like to see the Navy and Marine Corps SysComs do to help you?
I think for us, what would be really helpful is if we continue to coordinate on depot availability capacity in the country, right? Both aviation and surface side. We struggle. The Coast Guard, you know, on ship repair, for example, we have one organic shipyard out of Baltimore, which is not nearly big enough to take, and doesn't do anything for us out here in the Pacific, obviously. And so, you know, as the Navy has pushed out into the commercial shipyard industry now in the last couple of years, they really have sort of blocked out the sun in terms of our availability of using those commercial yards that we relied on. And so if you run a ship repair business and the Navy wants to roll in and dry dock, you know, do a $40 million dry dock for an LHA, and we say, hey, how about our little Coast Guard ship for $2 million? You know, we just don't see any really responses, almost no responses today to a lot of our dry dock and dockside repair packages, which means we pay for the ones that do respond. So I think we just need more coordination on that, I think.
Yeah. We make all the shipbuilders sign a non-competitive clause that says they can
With the
only do
Coast Guard,
Navy work.
yeah.
Sorry about that. We'll work on that.
We are working on it. I mean, this is not a new revelation or anything. We've been working that quite a bit to try to figure out how we can coordinate schedules, for example, right? If my folks know sort of when the Navy has little gap, because the Coast Guard would be filler work between the Navy projects. That's how we do it. And the yards love that. And instead of us saying, hey, we got to do our project during this 6 weeks, maybe what's 6 weeks you have available between big Navy projects that we can use. And so we're getting there.
Yeah, I think we ought to sit down and talk about that because, you know, I think stable, predictable work in the ports is what gets us the performance level that we want. It gets the industry to grow capacity. So if there's an opportunity for us to marry our maintenance programs up, I'm all ears. So let's have that conversation.
Great, so we'll move on to other questions. So when you ask a question, make sure you state your name and your affiliation. So, sir.
Kai Alberg, member of the U.S. Naval Institute. It's probably fair to say that software and having up-to-date software will increase in importance over the next decade. I've read that a major software upgrade to the F-35 is likely to cost in the billions of dollars. When you look at private companies like Tesla, they seem to have a very streamlined system to continuously push software update out to their products. How close is it realistic to believe that we would be able to get to that model, and what obstacles do you see would have to be overcome to get closer to that model?
I think that's
Well, let's just look at Alice for F-35 and the importance of establishing the architecture. And Ms. Lord, in the previous session, talked a little bit about Alice and F-35, and she's very much engaged in making sure that we get that correct. So that's really going to be the crux of F-35 software development, at least on the support side, is getting the architecture right for Alice. What are the obstacles? I mean, the obstacles are that we have a lot of these aircraft that are operating, and transitioning the system in operations is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge.
We're going to jump over here to Megan.
Hi, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. Back to requirements development. On the frigate program, the Navy successfully pulled industry and operators and requirements folks and budget folks together early on in the requirements evaluation team process. And we heard a lot of great things about the results that yielded. But for the next two programs with CHAMP and with the large surface combatant, I know CHAMP got thrown back because it was looking like it would cost too much, and large surface combatant got postponed a bit. So I wondered if those point to any limitations to the RET process, or if perhaps they kept the Navy from going down the wrong path. And then if the other panelists could maybe comment on any pros and cons that they've experienced on bringing industry and operators in early.
You don't think there's a limitation to the process. I think the process is right. I think the key is, back to the requirements is, what is it exactly that you want, and then getting a realistic cost of what that is. And those two tend to collide often. So I've watched the large surface combatant with great interest over the last 4 years, and frankly, I think we've pushed it to the right for good reasons. We think Flight 3 meets the needs. I think the threat's evolving. We're looking at unmanned, so we don't want to rush into this. But clearly, as we work through that process, the first go-around was a platform that was going to be pretty expensive. And so I think, you're hearing the Secretary and the CNO talk about distributed maritime operations. You're hearing them talk about high-low mix. Does everything have to be a high-end process? So I think that's, I think the requirements evaluation team process works. I think it's the best way to do it. I think involving industry early is the best way to do it. But you're going to have some cost realism in there up front in terms of defining what hey, I'm not willing to pay more than this. And those two often collide too late in the game, in my opinion. So I think the process is fine. I think we ought to continue to fine-tune it. And I think frigate's a great example where it's going to work, and we've got to go learn from that going forward.
Thank you. Sir?
They've been waiting longer.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Bill.
Bill Hamblet, Naval Institute Proceedings. So inherent in great power competition is an adversary who's great or is moving quickly. Admiral Becker, you asked if the PLA was here. No hands went up, but I guess they're sort of the elephant in the room. So the adversary is moving quickly and developing and fielding capabilities quickly. How is the threat aspect driving your challenges? And do you feel confident you're keeping ahead of it or keeping up with it, pacing the threat? That's my question.
That's sort of open-ended. So, Admiral Becker, what do you think to start?
Well, for those of you who are industry folks, we need your help. We need your help making sure that you protect our data. And there are a variety of ways to do that. The department is leaning forward to try to help you help us with the CMMC process. That's a certification process, and there are levels to that, and there's still some, I think, some error in the system that we're working out, the differences between the NIST standards and CMMC, but the punchline is we need your help. We need your help to protect our data when it's in your organizations and in your networks, and when it's in your suppliers and the second and third tier suppliers. So where does that go? How do we think about that differently? We're looking for your help because we need to protect our data.
So related to Bill's question, the DoD is pursuing a new concept for joint all-domain command and control, as well as a new joint warfighting concept. To what degree have your organizations been brought into that discussion about what are the implications of this new approach to warfare for the kinds of systems that we need to buy and the kinds of ways they need to be able to work together? Has that conversation been happening?
It has. I mean, I'll step into that one first. The Marine Corps is kind of in a unique position where we are integrated as a naval force. We move ashore from a naval ship, a surface combatant, and having the ability to connect back to that ship and to command and control forces ashore with the Navy is absolutely essential. Well, once we're ashore, we've got this inescapable need to interoperate with the U.S. Army. And so there's a vertical situation, there are horizontal situations in terms of both lines of communication and signals and across the spectrum of warfare that you have to plan for. JADC2 gives us a really opportune venue to to get to both of those things from the Corps' perspective? Because that's just reality.
I'll just add to the answer by saying that, there's always going to be an aspect of reaction as we are exposed to our adversaries' capabilities. But for the most part, I think, the path that we're on, our roadmaps, our technology roadmaps, the areas that industry is leading in, I think we provide very high-quality equipment to the warfighter. And we're at the point of, continuing to look, not only just look for those game-changing technologies, but to refine the technology that we have. So I think we're in a very good place in terms of the technology that we have, and we're going to continue to improve it.
Sir.
One more.
Okay, one more.
Oh, go ahead.
You guys can fight it out.
Go ahead. Okay, thanks.
Too tall, I'm going to pick this up. Jeff Zazulowicz with Navy Times. Question for Rear Admiral Becker. You mentioned sailors getting different email addresses depending on their duty station and never having like a uniform account. This was brought up in the Chief Information Officer's report last month. So kind of a two-part question. When can sailors and Marines, in your view, expect to just have a single, first dot last name at Navy.mil email throughout their career? And perhaps more importantly, how did the Navy get to this point? The CIO told my colleagues that, the Navy systems are 15 years behind the private sector. All these reports about Navy hacks, via the defense industry. There's reports today that a big supplier got hacked and that information is showing up online. In your view, how did the Navy get so far behind on this, and how long is it going to take? I know this is kind of a ongoing, evolving effort, and the report made that clear, but how do you guys get, out of this hole, so to speak? And if I'm not characterizing that right, please let me know. Thanks.
I'll try. I know in the interest of time, I'm going to keep this kind of brief, and we can maybe catch up. Part of it is the mindset of what the network's purpose was. In particular, our enterprise network. Think shore, both shore CONUS and shore out of the United States. It was looked at as an admin function, and over time, as the top line started coming down, and the criticality to find efficiencies. To save dollars, particularly post-2012. You can turn to support structures, the administrative nature of a network, and you can harvest from that. And we did. We harvested quite a bit of savings and efficiencies in our network. But that meant we couldn't do certain things to our network that we needed to do, modernization that we couldn't put in place. And so we have the network that we paid for. And over time, that gap widens. So now we're on a journey to try to assess how we can move forward and how we can start to build out that network which supports our warfighting capabilities, because a network itself is a warfighting platform. That different mindset is going to change how we look at the network. And if you read the documents both from the DoD and the DON CIO, and even the vectors from Secretary Modley, the network is not a place to take efficiencies. The network is a place where we're going to fight. And that goes the same for our networks at sea. So we have a path where we'll be collapsing the Naval Enterprise Network from our OCONUS networks, today called OneNet, but it's OneNet Far East and OneNet Europe and OneNet Pacific, which is, I think, 3 nets. So we'll collapse OneNet into the Naval Enterprise Network, which is NMCI here in CONUS, and that's a first step. And then looking to the future, how we start to migrate identity management, not just in terms of the networks, but identity management itself. That's how we'll get after that.
Quick follow-up. When can a sailor expect to have like one email address?
I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sir.
Hi, Mike Mann. I'm a retired SWO. So one of the key requirements in the RFP for the FFGX is what we call, or what I think the Navy refers to as the Frigate Architecture Framework. And that clearly is a new paradigm in that design. And I'm curious if that model is going to be carried forward in future ships. Have you seen enough success with it on the FFGX that you would carry that forward? And I'm curious about the relationship between you, Admiral Moore, and Admiral Becker. And if I could pose one other question for Admiral Peters. I think I got my first briefing on what became the Joint Strike Fighter in 1994. What's the timeline for the development of the next fighter, and is it going to take anywhere near as long as it did for the JSF?
Do you want to go first? Well, it's hot.
Okay, so I'll address the second question first. And let me start by saying that F-35 is an amazing capability, and it did take a long time to develop, and in some ways we're still refining that design, but it is a tremendous platform that we're going to fly for many years. The next generation air dominance, as I mentioned before, is already underway. We've completed an analysis of alternatives for that platform. And depending on the platform itself, I think will determine the timeline. We're still looking at the 2030s for that time frame. Some of it is budget dependent, but again, some of it is really the approach that's taken. But we haven't started in earnest on that program yet. So will it take as long as the F-35? I don't think so. Because I just don't think we can afford to take that long anymore. But we're looking at, right now, mid-2030s.
So to the second question, are we going to follow the same process on large service combatant? I think that remains to be seen. What I think is we're going to go see how the FFGX comes out, and we're going to go, I think we like the process we use, so there's a lot to like about the process that we would roll forward to the large service combatant. I think we're going to see when we down select here and start building the ship, we're going to learn, did we get it exactly the way we wanted to? So I don't want to commit that we're going to be using the exact same process on large service combatant, but it's hard to imagine that we're going to come up with a completely new process. I think the way we've done it here is a model for how we'd like to go, forward on the shipbuilding side of the house to reduce risk and get a platform to the fleet faster.
And just to tie that off, the way we'll stay integrated through the requirements process is but with people. We have people embedded in PO ships today to help us stay tied to the program, and I think that's going to pay dividends for us.
Thanks, Admiral. Last question.
Thank you. Good morning. I'll try and keep this concise. I'm new to the acquisitions field, came from cybersecurity stuff, and the one concern we're always focused on is talent management and retention. I was reading a few weeks ago that the time requirements to be an acquisitions professional, a uniformed acquisitions professional, have increased. And so my question to you, gentlemen, is do you see a slump in uniformed acquisitions workforce as the requirements to be an acquisitions professional start to increase?
I don't think so. And I'll say on probably about three different vantage points. Number one, by inserting professionals into every phase of force development, you get more experience opportunities. So you can be at N95 and write requirements for amphibious ships and have that account for your experience tour. You can do a tour at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab or at Naval Research Lab. There's structure throughout the naval enterprise there that provides you opportunity. Two, I'll tell you that if promotion is any measure of success, the Acquisition Corps is outpacing the rest of the Marine Air Ground Task Force workforce, or labor pool, if you want to look at it that way, by about 10 percentage points to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, almost 30 percentage points to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and about 10 percentage points higher to the rank of Colonel. So there's a recognition in the Marine Corps for this critical skill set. And then the third thing I'll leave you with is when you're modernizing the force, when you're looking very distinctly at a modernization effort, it demands that you have trained professionals to do it. So, bring a cigar and a bourbon, and we'll talk about it, is what I'd like to say.
I'll be there on Friday, General.
All right.
So I see how the Marine Corps is keeping their talent management in check. Yes, so we may have to adopt some of these techniques. It's an interesting question and about talent management in uniform, and mostly as we continue to always manage the size of our uniform workforce, those billets are, just like all other billets, are targets. So, but we are still seeing a lot of folks that are interested in technical and acquisition jobs, which is a good thing. And I think there's a lot more willingness on the part of our naval leaders to let folks go do that, so they can go do a technical or an acquisition job and then go back to the fleet for the department head tour, or in between department head tour and command. They can get that in, and we're bringing those folks back in to be program managers. And it's absolutely critical. Within NavAir, the uniform number of our employees is very small compared to the civilians, but they're really force multipliers. They're the ones that bring the mission relevance. So at every opportunity that I have, I try to encourage folks that are interested in acquisition or test and evaluation and those type of things. Say, let's get our talent there, and then get them back out to the fleet to do those requirements, and continue that cycle, because that's what's going to make our weapon systems more effective. So thanks for the question.
All right, well, thank you very much for the questions. Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, on behalf of the Naval Institute and AFCEA International, we thank our speakers and panelists today for taking their time and sharing their insights. We'd like to present each of you with a token of our appreciation, a Naval Institute book, A Brief Guide to Maritime Strategy by Naval War College Professor Jim Holmes. And also want to thank, special thanks to our sponsor today, Lockheed Martin, and to our audience. And before you go back to the main hall and get ready for lunch, please use the West app to provide some feedback on this session in the session survey. Thank you very much.